Hello, and welcome to the latest in ICCT's series of webinars on clean vehicles and fuels in India. I'm Joe Schultz, ICCT's Communications Director. In a moment, I'll turn the microphone over to Anup Bandavadekar, who is our India program lead and will be our presenter today. But first, a couple of housekeeping details. Apologize in advance to those of you who've already heard these several times. But we will run through our presentation first and take questions afterward. The presentation takes about half an hour, and there will be time for questions and discussion after that. If during the presentation you have questions to clarify something that's been said, feel free to use the chat function in your control panel. Our co-panelist today is Gaurav Bansal from ICCT's India program staff, and he will be able to answer some questions on the fly, so to speak, and otherwise queue them up for discussion later after the presentation is over. After the presentation, during the audio discussion, if you'd like to ask a question of Anup or Gaurav, please use the feature to raise your hand in the GoToWebinar control panel so that we'll know to unmute you and let you speak. So I think that's about it. Without further delay, let me turn this over to Anup.
Thank you, Joe, for that introduction, and welcome again to everybody. I'm Anup Bandavadekar, Passenger Vehicle Program Director, as well as the India lead for ICCT. And today's webinar, as Joe mentioned, is on the costs of transitioning to ultra-low sulfur fuels in India. For those of you who've been at least aware of this webinar series, this is the fourth one, I would say, in the series of webinars that we have done this year. And the goal of this webinar series, as usual, is to initiate a dialogue around auto fuel policy in India, which most of you would know that there is currently no roadmap for future vehicle emission control as well as fuel quality improvement in India. And the goal of this webinar series and papers and reports associated with it is to have a dialogue around the technical issues related to the auto fuel policy in India. A report that's pretty comprehensive related to it will be launched fairly shortly. At present, the report is under peer review stage, and we hope to release it as soon as we get through the peer review part of the process. As I mentioned, the previous webinars in this series had focused on vehicle emission standards, fuel quality standards and compliance programs, and the one last month on 2- and 3-wheelers. Today's webinar is, of course, on the ultra-low sulfur fuels, and really, to a lot of people perhaps attending this, there is little reason to explain why ultra-low sulfur fuels are an important aspect of the strategy to control vehicular pollution. But this slide basically summarizes how we think about ultra-low sulfur fuels. On the gasoline vehicles, given India is presently at Euro 3, Euro 4, Bharat 3, Bharat 4 stage with a 150 ppm sulfur limit on gasoline countrywide and 50 ppm in major cities. The sulfur content is low enough. On an average, on a sales weighted basis, around the country is around 90 parts per million. So it's low enough so that advanced emission control technologies don't have any bad effect. Of course, the lower the sulfur content from this point onwards, the better it is going to be. But if there are certain effects of fuel sulfur, they are going to be largely reversible at this stage. And so in some sense, going to next level of emission controls on gasoline vehicles should be possible even with present sulfur levels, even though reducing sulfur content in gasoline would be quite beneficial. On the diesels, the story is quite a bit more complex in that the diesel sulfur content of greater than 50 parts per million actually does inhibit performance of after treatment devices. And at present, India only has got 50 ppm sulfur fuel in about 20 major cities. Three were supposed to be added to that list beginning of last month. So maybe, and we don't have confirmation whether that's occurred. So around 20 cities in India have got the 50 parts per million sulfur diesel and gasoline fuel. But the rest of the country, the diesel is at 350 ppm. And that is really blocking the heavy duty fleet from progressing to Euro 4 level even. And they're stuck at Euro 3. But in order to get to really the emission controls devices, such as the particulate filter, or even effective functioning of the selective catalytic reduction or the lean NOx trap, both after treatment devices to reduce emission controls of NOx, lower sulfur fuel would be necessary. Finally, for all of these devices to really function appropriately at their higher efficiency level, less than 10 ppm sulfur fuel would be required. And that's really where we are. Just to compare India with the rest of the world, as I mentioned, India has reduced gasoline and diesel sulfur content to about Bharat stage 3 in all of the country and Bharat stage 4 in some 20 odd cities. And in doing so, it still lags much of the advanced markets of Europe or Japan or United States by 5 to 8 years. But even some of the other emerging markets are actually ahead of India in a reasonable term. And just to be in this region itself, Thailand, for example, now has 50 ppm sulfur fuel, both gasoline and diesel, available countrywide from the beginning of 2012, and which has enabled them to move to Euro 4 emission standards, both on light and heavy duty across the country, which is something India is not yet able to do. Other countries and regions around the world have similar plans, but so the trouble in the case of India is twofold. One, having this two-stage emission fuel quality for major cities and rest of the country, and then having the sulfur level high enough. So with that sort of as the background, ICCT launched a study with the help of two consultants who work together, Hart Energy Consulting and MathPro, who are both well versed in this topic area. And ICCT's intention was really to study the same situation in different countries, in Brazil, in China, in India, and Mexico. All of the countries where ultra-low sulfur fuels aren't available at scale today. All of the places which in some sense struggle with public sector oil companies to more or less scale. Differential fuel pricing in many cases, as well as continued subsidization of fuel through fluctuations in the oil market. And so while these kinds of characteristics are similar across these markets, their refinery structures are quite a bit different. And so the goal of this study was just to analyze what it really takes to get to ultra-low sulfur fuels in all of these four countries. Today's webinar, of course, focuses only on India. The study makes, of course, several assumptions. At present, we are focused mainly on on-road vehicles. even though in India at present, the off-road vehicles are essentially getting the same grade of fuels, but it's plausible to think that in the future, as the fuel quality improvements become more stringent, that there might be a separate grade for non-road non-road vehicles or marine sources, but we don't know that. And so the study is focused on road vehicles only. The study assumes that there is no crude switching in the sense that if India is using uh, the heavier or sour crude with high sulfur content today, then that would continue to be the case in the future. That switching to lighter or sweeter with lower sulfur content crude is not an option under this study. Uh, that the study doesn't assume that any new refineries are built only for the purpose of ultra-low sulfur fuels. The focus is really on upgradation of existing refineries. And of course, there are refineries in India that are already in the process of being built, and we'll get to how they are treated as a part of this. And of course, technologies are really commercially available technologies, technologies that are available at scale, and more or less well known in the industry today. And those technologies really fall broadly into two categories. One, that of hydro treating and hydro cracking. The hydro treating, which is really aimed at stripping out sulfur from the fuel feed. And part of the hydro treating, which is the FCC feed hydro treating, the FCC is really the fluidized catalytic conversion. Hydro treating is for improving the yield, whereas the naphtha hydro treating side is really for reducing sulfur content in gasoline. Similarly, the distillate hydro treating is the process used for reducing sulfur content in diesels. In general, the hydrocracking, which actually needs to break down the heavier crude fractions into lighter fractions, is a more stringent process. It's a more heavy-duty process, if you will, and because of that, the process requirements are more strenuous, leading to a higher cost in investment as well as in operation. During the study process, we did pay careful attention to the overall fuel quality, not just sulfur content, as well as any losses in yield. So the study includes, or at least make sure that the octane number in gasoline, for example, would be maintained at 91 RON in India at present. If there are any losses in yield during this process, then those losses are made up. I should just make a note at the bottom. It says that there is a chapter 2 in the study that contains a tutorial on refining and production of ultra-low sulfur fuels. And those of you who, like me, are not the refining experts, I think you would find it to be extremely educational to go through that material. This map actually is showing where these refineries in India exist today. The red circles represent refineries, and the size of the circle really represents the size of the refinery, and the scale shown there in the left-hand bottom corner. The yellow stars are, of course, the cities where there is Bharat Stage 4 fuel already available. And that's roughly about 30% of the present fuel quality. And as you see, some newer cities are being added. Some of those are at the intersection of major national highways, but it isn't really clear what the strategy is to add fuel to 50 additional cities, as the Ministry of Petroleum and Natural Gas has suggested. But for the time being, we focus on the refineries themselves, and these refineries can be broadly classified in India in 5 categories. The first 4 categories are related to the existing refineries in India. The fifth category, the transition year category, are the refineries that were planned or were already under construction when the study started. So some of these refineries, like the Bina refinery or the Batenda refinery, have already been completed. But the rest are still undergoing, and quite a bit of refining capacity is being added through these transition year capacity. Of the existing refineries, the category A refineries are really the modern export refineries, and most of them are really located here in Jamnagar, the SR refinery and the Reliance refinery, which are very large, modern, state-of-the-art refineries with hydrotreating capacity to treat actually fairly high sulfur content of crude into very low sulfur ppm in the fuel output. The other grade, the other category or grouping of the refineries is also a grouping that already has certain amount of cracking and hydroprocessing ability, an ability to take up fairly high sulfur content of crude. And again, a fairly significant chunk of these refining capacity. Again, these are not very small refineries. These are decent sized refineries. As compared to the Group C, which are really very small refineries. Just look at how small of the output is for 4 refineries, many of them in the northeast of India. And these are fairly basic refineries. Some of them, in fact, all of them actually require sweet crude for functioning, and really have a little by the way of cracking or hydroprocessing capacity. And those that didn't really fall nicely into the first 3 categories were lumped into the other conversion group D, with a moderate amount of complexity and again different level of ability to treat higher grade of sulfur fuel. Finally, the transition year capacity, as I mentioned, it's assumed based upon the available data that they would have an ability to treat sort of a 40-60 mix of sweet versus sour crude. And the specs of all of these refineries are already such that they're all being planned to meet at least the Bharat Stage 4, which is the Euro 4 50 parts per million fuel quality. And so that's their baseline for the transition year capacity, from which they would need to improve further to 10 parts per million in terms of fuel capacity. What are the main costs that are involved in this? Of course, there are capital costs, which are annualized in this term, the annual capital charges, the annualized capital charge ACC ratio, which are associated with the upfront investment in the refining. But along with the upfront investment in refining, there are additional costs of operation in order to provide additional hydrogen to get sulfur out, or if there is any loss of yield that needs to be replaced, and the costs of that are included in these cost estimate. If any aspects of fuel quality deteriorate, for example, octane number goes down on gasoline, then it has to be made up, and that cost has to be added. And any other additional direct operational costs, because presumably we've added new equipment to the refinery, which has got additional energy consumption and water consumption and so on. So that those costs are then included as a part of this. So these are both capital cost and operating cost together. And just to go into the details of the how the capital costs are evaluated, for the methodology for doing that is a fairly standard one, that most of these costs are evaluated in relationship with a US Gulf Coast refinery, partly because that's where most of the knowledge, initial knowledge in the industry has originated, and it's a pretty standard practice to use that as the baseline. and then adjust that baseline with a country-specific location factor, which actually in the case of India happens to be 0.98, indicating that the cost of building a refinery in India are not necessarily all that lower when you compare it to the cost of building a refinery in the US Gulf Coast. So marginally lower cost, but not really a big discount, indicating that most of the costs are material and equipment costs. The ACC ratio itself is a function of a variety of economic parameters, including construction period and project life and what sort of tax rates the companies face, so on and so forth. And for all the countries in the study, we used baseline values. And we use a sensitivity case that was sort of India specific. And of course, it's possible that one might sort of argue that this parameter should be instead of 10 years, 15 years, or 7 years, or whatever is the case. But the main goal was to try and evaluate the sensitivity, combined sensitivity of all of these parameters as we look into the overall costs of production. What the results indicate to us is that the costs are not negligible, they're substantial, but they're also not as high as perhaps some of the figures that may have been thrown around. Recall that what the oil industry has stated in the past, that the cost of coming from where India was in year 2000 to the Bharat 3, Bharat 4 stage fuel quality in 2010 as a part of the auto fuel policy took an investment of about 32,000 crore rupees. At the present rate, that's about $6.5 billion or so. The estimate that we have based on this study is that now to take whatever we have now to go down to 10 parts per million sulfur fuel in gasoline and diesel countrywide will require an investment about $4.1 billion or 21,000 crore rupees. With a certain sensitivity parameters, the cost could swing all the way up to $5 billion or 26,000 crore rupees. But that's the range of which really the cost to go to 50 ppm sulfur fuel countrywide is slightly lower than half of it. It's about 10,000 crore rupees, $2 billion roughly. And a little bit more than that to go to 10 ppm sulfur. Now, any costs that have to do with the refining sector are big. So there are billions of dollars and hundreds and thousands of crore rupees. Just to put that number in perspective, that the 12th five-year plan for public sector refinery investment is for $31 billion. And of course, part of this $31 billion is already towards lower sulfur fuel to be supplied in many of the refineries. So actually additional investment over and beyond what's already planned would be actually quite a bit lower than $4 billion. And the way some of the newer refineries have come up are actually a partnership between somebody in a private sector and a public sector refinery. And some of the newer refineries are examples of that. So there's going to be some additional private sector investment as well. Essentially, the point being that the costs are not negligible, they are substantial, but the costs are not very high either when you put that into the perspective. When we try to calculate the costs on a per liter basis, so these are now no longer just the investment costs, these are investment costs and operating costs all normalized in a per liter basis of fuel supplied. The cost is about 1 cent per liter, 1 US cent per liter, or about 40 to 50 paise, half a rupee per liter of fuel price. Now that should be put in context with the current fuel price of about 75 rupees per liter for gasoline and 47 rupees per liter of diesel. So it's a fraction, it's some a fraction of a percentage in terms of cost. Of course, the transition year refineries, since they already have the capacity to produce 50 ppm and only have to do a small amount to go to 10, cost much lower. Now this range, this 0.9 to 1.1 cent, is the average for refinery groups A and D. If you looked within each refinery groups, you might see a wider range. So some of the refineries the cost, for example, on gasoline might be as low as 0.2 cents per liter, but there might be the Group C refineries, which are the small refineries, where the cost may be as high as 2 cents or 2.2 cents per liter. And this number represents the average for groups A to D. Similarly, for Group E, 0.2 to 0.3 is the average for different cases. And when we combine the entire capacity, essentially what we are seeing is that the costs are going to be something like 35 paise to 45 paise per liter. So less than half a rupee per liter for gasoline and diesel in terms of price increase. As I said, we evaluated these costs in other countries as well, in China, in Mexico, in Brazil. When you kind of compare the costs that we have in India versus the cost we have in other parts, it appears that India actually benefits from starting with a better baseline in terms of refinery technology. And comparatively, the costs are lower in India in terms of the total investment or the per liter cost that you see overall compared with other countries. Just to come to the conclusion of the presentation, I mean, yes, there are costs, and the costs are substantial. $4 to $5 billion is a big amount of money. But of course, we have to put the costs in the context of the benefits which the ultra-low sulfur fuels enable. Our preliminary estimate of the gains from just premature mortality reduction from cleaner vehicles and fuel policies are about 4 to 7 times the cost of going to lower sulfur fuels and having more stringent emission standards. And there are benefits in this that we have encountered in terms of morbidity, or whether any of the short-lived forces for global warming go down, or any of the impacts on agricultural production, so on and so forth. The details of all of this as to the methodology by which we estimate the benefits, we will discuss in a forthcoming webinar. But for today, before I close, I would just spend a minute or two on the distribution issues. Whether distribution of cleaner fuel is going to have any or present any challenge in India. And the data that is available as of now suggests that the 4 main modes of supply through road, essentially by trucks and pipeline, are the ones sort of growing in their sort of importance relatively. Pipelines are really growing fast. But there is substantial movement of fuel through coastal waterways and railways. The growth in the pipeline, just notice the different years here. The scale is nonlinear up to 2000, and then it goes. But essentially, the pipeline capacity in India has tripled from year 2000, and substantial new pipeline capacity continues to get added. In fact, with having to supply just one grade of fuel across India rather than the 2 grades, one grade in certain major cities and another grade in the rest of the country, some of the logistical issues might be easier. On the other hand, if there is a decision in the future to separate the on-road fuel with off-road fuel, then there might be some more challenges to it. But overall, at least when India is concerned, the distribution and logistical issues don't appear to be the showstopper. It's really the policy guidance to go there. So our sort of recommendations based upon what you've seen before and what we see here is that the transition to 50 ppm sulfur fuel countrywide should be a real urgent priority. And then a movement towards the ultra low sulfur 10 ppm sulfur fuel as soon as that is possible. And of course, the cost of that of the order of half a rupee per liter has to be recovered, and that promise has to be made upfront to the oil sector that that cost will be recovered through going to ultra low sulfur fuels. So I will stop there. There is a whole host of material that we are putting on the web throughout this year, and you're free to go and look up or contact us directly, my colleague Gaurav Bansal or myself. But for now, I will stop, and we can take any questions that you
have. Thank you, Anoop. Once again, just to reiterate, we're happy to take questions now. We've booked about an hour for this webinar, so we have plenty of time for any follow-up. I'm getting some terrible construction noise in my location right now, which you may be able to hear. So I'm going to turn this over to Gaurav and Anoop to manage the audio for participants if they want to ask questions, so that I don't disrupt things with the drilling that's going on over my head. So Gaurav?
Okay, thanks, Joe. Yeah, we'll be happy to take questions. Following our pattern of the way we're doing things, if you have a question, please raise your hand on the GoToMeeting panel, and then we'll unmute you accordingly, and you can ask your question. So anyone can go ahead.
So there is a hand up from Sunil Pathak. So Gaurav, if you unmute Mr. Pathak. And there is also a question from Mr. Tapas Chakrabarti.
All right, Mr. Pathak, please ask your question. All right, Mr. Pathak, we'll wait. Maybe if you're having microphone problems, you can fix those. In the meantime, I'll unmute Mr. Chakravarti, and he can ask his question. Okay, it seems that Mr. Chakravarti is also having microphone or audio problems. Let me unmute Mr. Pathak again. Mr. Pathak, can you hear us, and can you ask your question? Okay, let me just say that if people are having difficulties with their microphones, they can also type in their question, and we can answer it orally.
Okay, at least I see another hand from Mr. Iyer. So do you want to unmute him and see if he's able to ask, or if there is a system problem that none of the participants are able to ask?
Hi, Mr. Iyer. Please go ahead.
Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, I have two questions for Anoop's very well-researched presentation. One is, what kind of time frame do you envisage in the switch over to ultra low sulfur fuel of 10 ppm, which you have mentioned? How many years is it going to be in your expectation? And the second question is, what role do you see the government allowing the private sector to play? The example I would like to give is that the Reliance Industries' massive refinery does have the capability to produce very low sulfur fuel, but the situation is such that it is not able to sell the fuel in India. So will this kind of a dichotomy continue to exist, and do you see that as a barrier to achieving the goal of introducing ultra low sulfur fuel in India?
Okay, thank you, Mr. Iyer. In terms of the time frames, essentially, what we realize is from the project approval phase to actually getting the fuel available and everything should be possible in a period of 2 to 3 years. But there are caveats to that about whether how long the project approval process takes, and from that is approval from the management and lining up of the financing. But very senior officials such as Dr. R.K. Malhotra of Indian Oil have stated that from the time that a go-ahead is given to these projects, a period of 3 years would be sufficient to make sure that all of these can be provided. As far as the role of government in allowing private sector refineries, I mean, you might realize that some of the fuel supply from these private sector refineries like Reliance is already occurring in India. Several of the oil companies or oil marketing companies which do not have as much a refining capacity as what they sell at the retail level, Hindustan Petroleum Oil Corporation comes to mind, are already purchasing fuel from Reliance or SR as the need be. And since Reliance and SR are able to essentially produce Euro 4 level fuel and are able to demand market price, these oil marketing companies in India are having to pay that market price and are actually supplying Euro 4 fuels already. So of course the losers in this case end up being the national oil marketing companies. So it does go back to the question of what happens with diesel price. Gasoline as of now has been broadly liberalized, although there are some political constraints still about gasoline prices going up or down. But at the broader level, that's in the open market. And in the diesel's case, we saw a 5 rupee per liter price increase earlier this year as the fiscal untenability of continued lower diesel prices became evident to the government. And there are indications that the government would be able to do so, but it's just going to take time for diesel prices to float with the market for quite some time in India. And so the other side of that story really is that India actually has got quite a bit of overcapacity. And if you look at the new transition year capacity that is being added, which is being added at Euro 4 level itself with 50 ppm sulfur fuel, there actually doesn't seem to be a lot of reason to hold back 50 ppm deployment countrywide in the next 2 or 3 years time frame based upon the current projection. The projects to go to 10 ppm and being able to produce that is another question. And of course, as I mentioned, there will be an additional cost, and that cost has to be made up. So there is a whole host of issues that need to be resolved to make it available.
Thank you very much, Anup.
Okay, Mr. Chakraborty has typed in a question, so let me just read it to you, Anup, and you can answer it. It's a two-part question. It's just, what is the effect on fuel efficiency of change in fuel quality? And so will there be any benefit in fuel efficiency of vehicles with a transition to ULSF?
Much of the difference that is going to happen between now to Euro 4 to Euro 5 fuels is going to be on the sulfur content. If you actually looked at what's the case in India, the cetane number is already at 51. The octane number is at 91. And by keeping those numbers there, it's really about reducing sulfur content, which doesn't really have any implication for fuel efficiency of the vehicles. Now, if the octane number were to be increased from 91 to 93 or 95, that may allow certain engines to increase their compression ratio and improve efficiency. But that's not something considered here. It's essentially maintaining at 91 RON of octane number. So no, this is really about reducing vehicular emissions. We have another question coming in from Nicholas Borchers.
Well, before we get to that, let me just read to you Mr. Sunil Pathak's question, which he has typed in. So he mentions that auto companies are already selling BS4 vehicles in some BS3 fuel cities. So his question is this justified for customers, as they may have problems with that?
So as I mentioned, for gasoline cars, there shouldn't be really any problems. That the real world emissions of those BS4 cars running on a BS3 fuel may not match what they are supposed to be at BS4 levels. Although that's not going to cause any problem, given that the BS3 sulfur content in gasoline is 150. And on an average, as I said, in India, the average is about 90. So as long as these vehicles are coming back and forth, it shouldn't really be a big problem for gasoline vehicles. For diesel, it might present a bit of a problem, although realize that currently, if it's a BS4 light duty diesel, it doesn't have any after treatment in terms of a particle filter or an SCR system on it. So unless it's a heavy duty vehicle, which none of the trucks actually have a particle filter in India, the present situation is not going to cause a problem. The BS4 buses, let's say, or certain trucks that might be running in cities with 50 ppm fuel, if they go outside, in many cases there are systems that use vanadium-based catalyst and are a bit tolerant to sulfur, but that's really not an ideal situation in our opinion. So BS4 trucks with SCR or buses with SCR systems, I think the current situation is a bit problematic, and we don't really think that's great. But for gasoline, I don't think that should be a problem situation, although the real life emissions will be higher than what we would want from BS4 cars.
Okay, now let me unmute Mr. Borchers and you can ask your question.
Hello, I'm online from Chile. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yes.
I wanted to ask you if you have any estimates or any idea on what would be the impact on NOx emissions with these ultra-low sulfur fuels?
Sure. And firstly, reducing sulfur content by itself will have a small impact on all existing vehicles and help reduce emissions from those. But the main gains in NOx emission reduction will come from going from BS3 emission standard, the Euro 3 emission standard, to Euro 4 or Euro 5 emission standards, which would actually help in substantially reducing emissions. And so in the case of both sort of the heavy vehicles, actually going to BS4 or Euro 4 or Euro 5 levels will add SCR systems that would help reduce NOx emissions substantially, along with PM emissions that would sort of go down because of the way engine is tuned. So there is a small direct effect from sulfur, and you might be able to see that in one of the briefings on the benefits of low sulfur fuels in India. Some references to that. But really, bulk of the benefits would go by this combination of cleaner fuels coming in combination with advanced emission controls and next set of emission standards for vehicles. When they go hand in hand, that's when we would realize most of the benefits in terms of NOx emission reduction.
Okay. And one more thing. Will this presentation be available, or some paper or study related to it?
Yes, both the study and the presentation would be available on the web. I think later today or tomorrow.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions?
Do we have any other questions? Yes. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Basu.
Hi, Anup. Can you hear
Hi,
me?
Partha.
Yes.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay, good. Actually, most of the questions have already been asked by a couple of people, and it's very good to hear them, those questions and the answers. I was speaking to somebody from the oil industry a couple of days back, and one of the issues, of course, was also the pricing. Now, you know that APM has been dismantled, especially in the gasoline sector, and now it is subject to market prices. And now there is a practice which specifically happens specifically in a couple of countries where they use the fuel prices for various things. For example, there are certain countries where the fuel prices has cess, environment, cess, etc., etc. Then there are fuel prices which has got prices for included prices for INC tests and testing center, especially those countries which run the centralized INC center programs. Now, with the private players coming into the game, and specifically now, which is new to India, the SR, the Reliance, how do you think the government will manage such things? Because it's going to, because this is something which is going to be a directive, and it's easier done with companies like HP, IOC, BP, because they are all PSUs. But it's, do you think it's going to be a challenge with this kind of companies?
I mean, of course, yeah. The issue is partly linked with fuel pricing. Of course, I mean, for all of the oil marketing companies, you could raise the price of the fuel by 50 paise and whatever. But if the Indian oil marketing companies have to buy that fuel from anybody, whether it's Reliance in SR within India or from outside of India, if they have to import finished product to meet ultra-low sulfur fuel requirement, then they would have to purchase it at market prices. And that would incur a loss to them, because certainly the private players such as Reliance are not going to be selling them to the oil marketing companies at a loss. So there is a serious fiscal issue involved here, and it does need to be addressed. At the same time, realize that the oil marketing companies continue to sell the fuel right now. That so if they are going to incur an additional price to get this cleaner fuel, and all this additional price in the fuel cost is 50 paise or so, then making up that much price would mean that the oil companies are not losing further amount. The issue in part is that whether in the face of seeing very low free cash flow in these oil marketing companies, whether they think any investments on their part are justified. And so that would mean, I mean, there is no return on that investment if
Yeah.
even this 50 paise is not promised to them.
Right.
Then they are guaranteed no returns, and so that would make them continue to be reluctant. And some of the oil companies have an expectation that when this next phase occurs, that not only would this fuel price increase be just this 50 paise, which is associated with the cost of going to these cleaner fuels, but that there will be even further fuel price increase that makes up, in some sense, the losses of the past few years. And that's a slightly different situation. But so in my mind, we should not conflate the two things. I mean, so what we wanted to get clarity on how much it costs to do this, and cost and pricing often tends to be different.
Yes, absolutely.
And just as we look longer term and we look at the fiscal situation of the Indian government, I'm not personally quite sure how long we as a country can afford to deal with the fuel pricing the way we have been dealing with it. But of course, it's a bigger political question than
No, absolutely. In fact, that's why I raised this question, because I was not exposed to this part of the story at all, and I just got to learn it from when I met this person from the oil industry.
Yes, I mean, if you've probably seen that Reliance or SR, which had opened up retail stations several years ago, have all been mothballed. Because the fuel prices aren't really floating with the market prices. And then there have been several high-level committees appointed by the Prime Minister, the present Prime Minister, including there have been 3 committees at least that I am aware of. One chaired by Mr. Mr. Chaturvedi, who used to be Oil Secretary and is now at the Planning Commission. One chaired, I think, by Rangarajan, and who's Prime Minister's advisor on oil price, on everything and economic issues, and one chaired by Mr. Kiran Parikh. So the policy sort of from the economic advisors of the government have very clearly stated that needs to happen. At this stage, this is, I mean, of course, a heavy lifting in terms of political decision, but I don't know how long it could be postponed from this point on.
No, thanks. Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah.
Welcome.
Do we have any last questions? Okay.
Oh, I see Mr. Ayer's hand up again.
Yeah, go ahead, Mr. Ayer.
Yes, time for one more question. I just wanted to know, though it's not 100% relevant to the subject of the webinar, but I'm curious to know whether any study has been done to establish what kind of benefits, if any, that would come to the older vehicles by the use of this ultra-low sulfur fuel. Right? For example, on the road, you continue to have BS3, BS2, and BS1, and even no BS kind of vehicles. So would there be any measurable significant benefit? Can you throw some light on that?
Yes, there would be significant measurable benefits by having lower sulfur fuels available, because essentially with lower sulfur content of fuels, PM emissions would go down. And again, I think some of those you can see in this briefing on benefits of low sulfur fuels, but I'm also happy to send it out again, that the way fuel properties would work, that having cleaner fuel, fueling all of the older fleet would bring in benefit. Now, of course, that benefit is by itself is small. I mean, so it's going to bring everything in the right direction, but to bring about large reductions, that by itself will not be sufficient. So absolutely, it will have benefits without a doubt, because the cleaner fuel will be fueling all of the fleet all at once. But that might barely overcome the growth in fleet, if at all. And so in order to really turn the emissions downwards and keep going them down in the face of increases in vehicle fleet, we will need the new emission standards. But you're right that this fuel would help.
Could there be a negative impact also in terms of faster wear and tear of the fuel injection system because of the low sulfur content and the loss of lubricity?
I am not aware of any such adverse impact. I mean, if you have heard of a specific impact like that, I would appreciate knowing about it. To my knowledge, I do not know of such adverse impacts from lower sulfur content. I mean, realize that other fuel quality parameters will be maintained in this process. But personally, I am not aware deeply about these issues, but I would appreciate knowing.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, it seems like we're above time, so we'll end it there. We'll also post this material on our website once we've reviewed it internally. If anybody has any further questions, they can always, of course, email Anup or myself, and just check out a lot of the material that's on our website, and maybe that can help answer a lot of questions too.
Yeah, and we would present the we would post the presentation online, and I think we would try to answer this last question from Mr. Iyer while we post that. And I think because I don't think right now I'm sufficiently knowledgeable to answer that question, Mr. Iyer, but I think we could post it along with the presentation. But thank you everybody for attending this, and hope to see you at another one of these webinars.
Okay, I'll be closing this down. Thanks, everybody.